Yes, hello, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for Praxis for actually giving me the opportunity to do 2 years of research on this project, which is really gratifying. Yeah, I hope that a lot of you have come across the project at some point or other, so I'm just going to give you a very quick run-up overview of what we've done. Our project was dealing or is dealing with machine translation and language learning and teaching and actually also assessment. And what I'm going to do today is just give you a brief overview what Praxis has given us money for and what we've done and examples of some of the outcomes of the project. Our starting point was the fact that we are in LAL, in Languages and Applied Linguistics, and a lot of our ALs came to us increasingly over the last 5 years and said that they were worried and they had a problem with machine translation tools, which they felt just kind of a gut feeling that they were getting very, very good. And our classical way of teaching it, which was focusing on its weaknesses, wouldn't work anymore. So we would, for example, tell students, try to translate X, Y, Z with Google Translate, and they would come out with a bad translation. And there was even this kind of typical, this is a Google Translate translation, kind of a funny sentence that didn't make sense. And then we would have taught students that it's much better to translate yourself. But that didn't work anymore. And our ALs, who were, of course, at the forefront of teaching, were concerned about it. So we decided, a team of central academics and ALs together. At that point, at the beginning, only from German and Spanish, we decided that what we need to do is actually really find out about what's going on. We need to collect data. We need to understand what's going on with machine translation. We need to find out what are their attitudes, what are students' attitudes, what are central academics and ALs' attitudes, what do they do with it, when do they use it, and so on. And then from that data, we wanted to consider whether our curriculum should be adjusted so that we, at the OU, of course, we have an obligation, or we pride ourselves in being at the forefront of teaching and digital teaching and pedagogy. So we decided that we wanted to look at, do we need or should we adjust our curriculum? And then, of course, together with the curriculum comes assessment, because what we teach, we also need to assess in some way. So is there any way in which we can incorporate machine translation tools into this? So this is the outline. And as I said, it's kind of gone into a huge project over 2 years. What did we do? We collected data in a variety of ways. And I think it was very gratifying because the project met with a high interest among students, among ALs, among central academics. Over the 2 years, we've had a team of more than 10 people now. We had people from German, French, Spanish. We had a professional data analyst to help us. And nearly 100 students also participated at some point, which gave us very valuable information. We started by doing surveys, and then following from the surveys, we did what we called focus group interviews. So we interviewed students and ALs and central academics for their opinions. Then we came up with some ideas and some basic strategies, and we got together in a task force meeting, or 2 task force meetings actually, where we sat together and just kind of tried to pool together our ideas. What can we do? What is the outcome? What can we do with the data we've collected? How should we react to machine translation in our teaching and assessment? And then our team put together exercises, mostly the wonderful ALs who've worked on our team. And then we did workshops in which we tried these exercises and again collected ideas, collected opinions, and so on. So this is all very theoretical now, and let's just look at what we actually came up with. This is just an example from German because I'm a lecturer in German, but we have come up with similar examples for Spanish, for French, and you don't need to understand any German to follow me now, so don't worry. So our first step is to come up with ideas of how can we actually, activities for teaching, how can we actually teach machine translation in a way that students will gain knowledge that we think is important and is part of being a language student in the 21st century, 22nd century, where are we? 21st century, in the 21st century. And it's also something that we feel, that we had one of the biggest or most important results was that on all sides there was a huge desire for clarification. Our ALs and our students, one of the things they kept saying in the interviews and so on was, please tell us how to handle this. What is plagiarism? What can we do with machine translation? How can it support our language teaching and so on? So I tried to come up with buzzwords for the learning skills that we thought that machine translation can be useful for. There are more, but I think these are really at the center of all levels of all languages, and of course, independent of what you actually, the examples you're using, the language you're using, and so on. So just to give you, I will give you a bit more precise examples, but just to come up, if you look at, just to explain, if you look at the 7 I've put on this slide, there's 2 things, the bottom things, where you can use the machine translation tools as a kind of tool to support your learning. For example, with the help of Google Translate, you can practice pronunciation. So there's a little button you can press and it will pronounce the most absurd long German compound nouns and you will understand how to pronounce them. And actually, again, Google Translate has a very useful function where with a little adding a star to a word, you can build your own glossary. So while you're working through a text, while you're working through teaching materials, you can single out the words that you've translated with the help of Google Translate and put your own glossary. So you will have a very individual vocabulary set at the end that is really tailored to what you need. So these are typical things. They exemplify things that you can do with the actual free on the web machine translation tools. And then there's more kind of things that we can do with them. We as a teacher can help you to do. And as I said, I've listed some examples here. For example, you can use machine translation to define rules, to reflect and compare different translation, to derive meaning, to understand complex texts or original sources above your usual teaching level or learning level. And also, for example, to play around, understand different registers in a language. This sounds all a bit theoretical now. I'm happy to answer more questions, but let's use our last few minutes to give you an example of defining rules. So we have, would be directed as a first-year student who is relatively at the beginning of learning. And in German, we have 2 ways for saying no or non, which is kein and nicht. So what we could do is instead of we explain a rule and students would then just repeat the rules and try to play around with it, we could challenge students to find out about their own rules, which would perhaps also stimulate their understanding of grammar. Some students, of course, learn better by teaching themselves something. It has something, in a way, there's a connection to flipped classroom methodology as well. So, for example, you would have given them a set of German sentences. The first step of the exercise would be you read the sentences and then you put them into a translation machine. Either DeepL, Google Translate, there's pros and cons for each of them. And then the third step would be you look at the English sentences. And the fourth step would be you think about why does the machine sometimes translate them as doesn't have or don't have, and sometimes as not, are not. And it's not very difficult. You would probably be able, as a student at level 1, to come up with the rule and understand the rule. And our idea would be, of course, that you have a chance by teaching yourself this rule to enlarge your understanding of this rule. You will have, so to say, achieved it yourself. So this is a typical example of this kind of thing. You would use machine translation to help students to define their own rules. I've also said there is, for example, the chance to compare translations or to reflect on text. The word or the whole idea of reflecting on your own learning and taking ownership of your own learning is very important in our ideas, what we think could be done with machine translation. So for example, you would have a task, you work in a company that has offices in the UK and Austria, and you would have a task where you have to write a certain text with bullet points. So you start with a greeting, you introduce yourself, you say that you're learning German, you write about a job. This is pretty much what you're doing as a standard kind of first level assessment. You get a text to write and some bullet points what you're supposed to write in the target language, in German in this case. And now you could, of course, use machine translation as a tool. Yes, thank you. You could use machine translation to raise the awareness of your own text and to be a critical reader of your own text. So let's say you've written the text in your own words in German, and then you think about what you've written, what you think you've written in English, and write it in English, so to say your own translation, into DeepL, and it translates it into German. And then you have your own version that you put together, and you have a version that's put together by the machine translation. And of course, you can compare them to both of them. And you could, for example, say now you spot 3 or 5 examples of differences. And you would explain why you have made this choice and why the machine has made another choice. Of course, again, it can be outright mistakes that you have made, for example, but of course, it could also be that you have chosen a different word, a synonym for something, and you could explain. So a very important idea in this learning with the help of machine translation is always this idea of reflecting. So here, again, you would have a student an own text, then a text version of what they think they've said, and then the comparison between the two. And just to give you a final example in the final minute, because I've explained to you before that the actual machine translation tools can be used to become a highly individual learning tool, which I think is actually a pretty cool thing to do. And it's something I had no idea about when I started with this project. So for example, I've explained before, this is a typical surface of Google Translate, and you see the little star. And by pressing the star, you've put in a phrase, I work full time. The machine has translated it correctly as Ich arbeite Vollzeit. And it's something that you want to know, and you would perhaps in the old days put on your index card or something. And with a little star, you can put this together in your glossary. So you have a highly individual, high-tech learning tool that you can then, again, of course, you can put it added to asking yourself to your learning studies and so on. Okay, now I've rushed through it. I could give you more examples, but I think it gives you the general idea of what we're trying to do. If you look at the learning skills, I think this is really the core, because this is what we've really been working on for 2 years. What can you do? What practices, what ideas and exercises can you do to help students increasing and using these learning skills? As I said, our ideas for assessment are very closely connected to this. But I don't think this is now the time in 15 minutes to go through all this. I'm very happy to answer your questions, give you other examples later on. Thank you for listening.